Commencing roll call now. Vice Chair Blair Whitney.
Here.
Councilmember Juan Carlos Prado.
Here.
Councilmember Everardo Rodriguez.
Here.
Councilmember Jennifer Reese. Councilmember Nakat Cersey. Councilmember Kathleen Daly. Councilmember George Salmon. Chair Brooke Sesser.
Sure.
Thank you.
Item number 2, public comment. Anyone may speak up to 2 minutes on any topic on the agenda. If you wish to speak, please fill out a speaker slip, bring it to the clerk. Please note the council may not discuss or take action on items not on the agenda. If you're attending online, please use the raise hand function to identify yourself as a speaker.
During this time, members of the public on Zoom and in the multipurpose room, if you would like to come up to the podium to do public comment, please fill out a speaker slip or use the raise hand feature on Zoom. Last call for public comment. There are no public comments. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Deanna. Agenda item number 3, briefing and discussion on the California Department of Housing and Community Development's review and comment on the county's 2022 to 2031 draft housing element. This discussion is going to be led by Will Gibson of San Mateo County Planning and Building. Will, the floor is yours. I see you're in the room.
Thank you. I am in the room, but Diana, can you hear me? You have
Volume.
my video is turned off.
Hang on just a moment, Will.
Certainly.
Hey, Will, could you try speaking again?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes,
That's
thank
much
you.
better. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm getting the message that video is locked for this Zoom, so I'm unable to show my screen.
We will take care of that.
Thank you. Greatly appreciated.
You may try now.
Success. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. Thank you, Chair Esser. Thank you, council members, for inviting me here tonight to have this discussion. I'm here and members of staff as well. I'm here to discuss a brief overview of the housing element itself, just as a recap for those members of the council who may not have been here for prior presentations on it, of which there were several, and then the California Department of Housing and Community Development's comment on the housing element that we submitted. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and my presentation. Okay. And you should be seeing the presentation now. So as I said, I will go through a little bit of the background, just briefly, what is the housing element, the update process and the requirements, just to provide context, discuss the sections and housing goals that are incorporated in the housing element briefly, talk a little bit more about the regional housing needs allocation and the sites inventory components of the housing element and the rezoning program that we incorporated in the document, and then turn to what we received as review and comment from the Department of Housing and Community Development. And I'll go through those in some detail, but not delving too deeply. And we will have plenty of time, hopefully, to discuss any of those particular items that the council wishes to go further into, and then talk about the next steps in the process and open it up for discussion. So turning to the overview of the housing element itself. So just some background, and this will be redundant for those council members and members of the public who have seen these presentations before, and I apologize for that, but I will keep it to a brief overview. So the housing element is a plan for the housing that is needed in a given jurisdiction or community, a city or a county. It's part of the county's general plan, We must have a housing element by state law. It assesses our current housing needs and our future housing needs over the next 8 years. It includes housing policies and programs that we will adopt to meet those needs. It must be updated every 8 years on a schedule that is established by state law. The county's housing element is for the unincorporated county only. Every city has their own housing element that they also are adopting on the same schedule. And once we draft the housing element, we must submit it to the state for their review of compliance with state law. And that is to the Department of Housing and Community Development at the state, who reviews it and provides us an initial letter stating how they feel our housing element does comply or not comply with the law, and suggesting how we may improve it, which is the fundamental issue that we're here to discuss today. And just before I move on, this is the housing element website for the county's housing element update. HCD's comment letter is posted there. The version of the housing element that was released for public review and then amended to be submitted to HCD is also there. Our environmental review of the housing element, which is required prior to adoption, is there. Other information on the update process, public outreach, comments received, and the full sites inventory, where we identify the developable and redevelopable sites that we think will meet our housing needs over the next 8 years, as well as sites that we've identified to rezone in order to meet our needs, is there. You can click through, and there's an online mapping tool, which is very handy to explore the sites and see where they are, what the nature of them is, and what assumptions we are making about their future developability. So the basic components of the housing element, which are required by state law: it must assess our demographics, our housing conditions, and our housing needs. It must evaluate constraints to housing production. It has to assess and inventory the resources available to assist housing for both development and for rental assistance, for affordable housing assistance, and other types of assistance that are available. It must include an evaluation of the prior housing element and how effective it was. It must identify the capacity to meet our projected housing needs, which is the regional housing needs allocation. I'll discuss that in a moment. And it must have a sites inventory showing how we'll meet that. Then it must have a housing plan with goals, policies, and programs to meet those needs. And new this cycle, a fair housing assessment and a plan to affirmatively further fair housing. And the housing element is divided into the following sections: essentially demographics, existing conditions and needs, constraints, resources, review, goals, policies, and programs, our arena and sites inventory, and then a set of appendices, including detailed information about public outreach, affirmatively furthering fair housing, background information on the sites inventory, and a variety of other appendices which provide extensive background for the conclusions, policies, and programs that are in the body of the housing element itself. We've been working on the update for several years now. We kicked off in 2021, as you can see here, and proceeded with community outreach through the first phase, studies, and a draft update through 2022. In theory, we should have had a draft update available in mid-2022. That was the projected timeline. It was a little later, and housing element adoption technically should be by January 31st of 2023. We submitted our housing element to HCD on January 20th of 2023, so we are late for adoption, as is almost every other jurisdiction in the county and throughout the Bay Area as well. And here was the process of submittal to HCD. So we held Planning Commission hearing on October 12th of last year, 2 Board of Supervisors hearings in November and December, submitted the housing element in January, on January 20th of 2023. HCD by law has 90 days to respond. We received the letter exactly 90 days after submittal on April 20th, 2023. So the housing element has a range of policies and programs, and I will not list them here. There are some 30 to 40 policies and programs incorporated, addressing all range of housing issues. They are organized under these basic goals: protecting existing affordable housing stock, supporting new housing for low-income households, promoting sustainable communities, promoting equal housing opportunities, promoting equity through housing policy and investments, and requiring and encouraging energy efficiency, resource conservation, climate resiliency in new and existing housing. So just just to briefly touch on what really is one of the core components of the housing element is the RHNA and the sites inventory. The sites inventory, as I mentioned, is an inventory of all the developable and redevelopable properties available for housing production over the next 8 years that are sufficient to meet our regional housing needs allocation. And that can include not only sites, but credit for units that are in the development pipeline and reasonable projections of units like ADUs and others that we think will happen, although we don't have site-specific information about where. And the regional housing needs allocation is the amount of housing that we need over the next 8 years as determined by the state and ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments. The state determines the regional share. So the Bay Area's share of the statewide need for the next 8 years is determined by the state. ABAG then takes that and splits it up across all of the cities and counties throughout the Bay Area. Our share of that is our RHNA. And the housing element, again, must identify enough sites to meet the RHNA. If we do not identify enough sites, in general, we have to identify sites that will rezone to make them more developable with housing. So this is our RHNA, the last cycle from 2014 to 2022 versus the new cycle from 2023 to 2031. It's broken down by income level. So this is what the state is telling us we need by income level over the next 8 years. As you can see, it's the RHNA 6 is this cycle, and it is very significantly larger than the prior cycle. So in total, about 3 times greater than what we were required in the last cycle to plan for. And the big increases, which make sense, are in the lower income category. So you can see 153 units in the last cycle, it's now 811, and so on for the other income categories as well. So we and every other jurisdiction have a much greater challenge in planning for housing, and in particular affordable housing, to meet the need that is projected by the state and by ABAG. So the sites inventory, again, must assess sites available for housing production. That can be vacant sites and sites that are non-vacant, but are likely or potentially likely to be redeveloped. We can have credits for projects that are already approved but not built, or that are entitled or significantly advanced in the planning process that they're likely to be constructed. We can credit projections of ADUs and other anticipated non-specific sites if we can make a reasonable assumption. The sites must be feasibly developable. And again, if we have insufficient capacity, we must get to creating more sites through rezoning. So we broke our sites inventory into these categories, and this comes up in, this is important because it does come up to a significant extent in HCD's comment letter. We projected ADU production based on our past trends in the county. We projected SB 9 production, which is a new state law which allows the subdivision and or the small scale multifamily development of single family sites. We projected those sites forward based on the applications we had received to date since this law took effect. We included pipeline projects that are already underway, and then of course vacant and non-vacant sites that are suitable for development or redevelopment. And just to note, the sites inventory is listed site by site in a tabular format in the housing element, showing all the detailed information about the nature of the site now, the development assumptions that we are using to project forward what it could be developed as. It's also included in a map form, and this is shown here. It's both in the housing element as a hard copy map, and it's also available through an online interactive GIS tool where you can click on any particular site and see information about it, what the assumptions are, what the location is, and other useful information. And again, that is linked through the Housing Element Update website. So here you see our sites inventory versus the RHNA for our first pass without any rezoning. So we believed that we would have enough capacity for a 493 vacant single family units, 280 vacant multifamily residential parcels that could produce multifamily units, a little over 1,000 vacant non-vacant multifamily. We have 730 approximately units in the pipeline. We projected 355 ADUs, 176 SB 9 units for a total of 3,414. So that's 581 above what the RHNA asks of us. but we are deficient in the low income category and very, very close in the very low income category. And we are also very close to zero. 75 is a negligible amount in the moderate income category. So address this, we propose a rezoning program that is focused in 3 areas: Broadmoor, which is an unincorporated pocket in Daly City, the Harbor Industrial Area, which is an unincorporated pocket of Belmont, and unincorporated Colma, which is near the BART station. And so we essentially identified 87 parcels that could be rezoned to high-density multifamily residential. We projected the units that are buildable on those sites, and we came up with these totals along the bottom here. And with those combined, and oh yes, by the way, and so mapping those, this is the unincorporated Broadmoor, and it's just a very small pocket of commercially zoned properties that would be converted to residentially zoned properties. It's adjacent to other multifamily residential. Similarly, unincorporated Colma near the existing multifamily zoning, that PCDR that you see is all allows high density multifamily zoning. And then this portion of the Harbor Industrial Area in Belmont. So with those rezoning sites included, we now have a surplus. We have 2,515 units. We meet all of our categories with those projections. So with that, that's essentially the core. Again, I'm not going to go into all the policies and programs, although we will touch on some of them as we walk through the comment letter. But the RHNA is essentially the core, and the sites inventory is largely the core of the housing element. So moving on from that, I'll turn directly to HCD's review and comment. But let me just say, if anyone has a comment or question, obviously this is your study session. Please feel free, if you want to hold them till the end, you can hold them till the end. But also, if anything is unclear, or if you have a question that you feel is appropriately offered right now, please feel free to do so.
Well, this is Brooks. Could you flip back to the rezoning slide with the units identified on there? The different areas.
Okay, yes, certainly. That is here.
That was what I was interested in. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you really pick up very low and low, well, and moderate too, for that matter, if the rezoning goes through.
If the rezoning goes through, yes, given the density of the sites and the size of the rezoning, we are allowed to assume that a significant number of them would be lower income. And we also, of course, we have an inclusionary housing program in the county, which guarantees that a percentage of them will be low income. But for purposes of HCD's analysis, there's essentially a density threshold that once you reach that density threshold on the sites, the assumption is that a significant number of them would be lower income. So that is what is happening here. You are seeing quite a few of them in the lower income categories. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can I ask a question? I wonder if an ADU unit counts the same as a 1-bedroom apartment, or how does that count?
For purposes of the RHNA, it does. So if you have an ADU, and we made assumptions about how affordable ADUs are based on some studies that have been done in the Bay Area that show what they typically are. So typically they're kind of split almost equally across the income categories. Some of them tend to be low income, some of them tend to be moderate income, some of them tend to be above moderate. It's pretty evenly distributed. For the purposes of the RHNA, yes, each of them counts the same. So a single family apartment would count the same as an ADU. But for purposes of the need for larger family units that have larger numbers of bedrooms, and for purposes of other special needs populations, they do not count. So just in a numbers term, yes, but in terms of other programs that we are trying to achieve to make our housing element suitable, not necessarily.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions for Will at this point? Kathleen, go ahead.
So North Fair Oaks is not included. You've already met your goals by these 3 areas?
For the rezoning, yes. So we do just to be clear, there is a rezoning proposal going on in North Fair Oaks. It rezones a small number of parcels from smaller scale multifamily residential to a higher density of multi-residential. We did not count those sites and those rezonings in these numbers. But we did count a number of other sites that had already been rezoned since the last housing element, that in particular, a number of projects that are already underway, but also a number of sites that are either they're underutilized industrial or commercial sites, or other sites that are really much more valuable as housing that are now allowed to be developed as housing. We counted those for the basic RENA, but we didn't propose any additional zoning in North Fair Oaks. And HCD did push back on some of our assumptions. We most likely are going to have to adjust our sites inventory, find some different sites most likely, and also make some additional justification for why we think sites are redevelopable. But we don't intend to propose any additional rezoning in North Fair Oaks. Seeing no further questions. So I'll just move directly into HCD's comment. Again, we submitted on January 20th, received it on April 20th at the very end of the legal timeline. And in general, it's both heartening and not heartening in multiple ways. HCD did not reject outright any of our assumptions or conclusions. They didn't reject our sites inventory. They didn't reject the nature of the sites. They did ask for significantly more extensive analysis, more granular analysis, and also more regional analysis and comparison in terms of needs, in terms of housing conditions, and in terms of the sites. They asked for much more justification of our development and redevelopment assumptions. They asked for detailed description and assessment of needs and constraints with greater data and more specific data. They asked us to build out our policy commitments and our programmatic commitments in much more detail. So firmer commitments, more specificity in how much money we'd be asking for, in when we would be doing various parts of policies and programs. They asked for, not surprisingly, because none of the jurisdictions, including us, have done a fair housing analysis as part of the housing element before. So we were unsure of how to do it, and we hope to gain more assistance from HCD on that, but they asked for a much more robust analysis of fair housing issues. And then they did identify some components we just missed that are newer in the law or that were left out. So that's kind of the general overview, but there was no outright rejection or outright expression that we had done anything that was not in compliance with the law. It was more amend this to provide more. So their first comment was the review of the prior housing element. We went through policy by policy and assessed what had been completed, what was the status of each policy, where it was at, whether it was carried forward to the new housing element. What HCD wants to see is also an assessment of, do we feel it's effective? Why is it effective? Why is it not effective? How could it be made more effective? So we did more of a status update and a progress update, but we did not qualitatively make an assessment of this was effective and it should be carried forward, but it should be changed in X, Y, and Z ways, or it was ineffective and could be fixed in these ways. So they want a much more detailed assessment of that. And they also want an evaluation of the cumulative effect of the policies in meeting the needs of special needs populations, which is not something that's been required previously. And we were to a certain extent unaware that was something that was being looked for. So not just the policies individually, but how they work together to meet special needs populations, and how could they be improved to do so if they're not meeting those needs. So our response to that is yes, we can and we will incorporate that information into the housing element. Second comment was fair housing complaint referral in compliance with federal and state fair housing laws. We did not describe our process for fair housing complaint referral, nor how we comply with federal and state fair housing laws. So we can include, again, this was just something that we were unaware was a necessity. It has not been in prior housing elements. So we will simply add this. This is our housing department is working on this, and that will be incorporated. Integration and segregation and disparities in access to opportunities. So we looked at integration and segregation in unincorporated communities throughout the county, how those impact populations, and the kind of long-term historical patterns. What we didn't do, we didn't compare across the county and with the region. And HCD is asking us to make a comparison. How do integration and segregation patterns in the county and disparities in access to opportunity compare with other jurisdictions and compare to the region as a whole? So it's a larger analysis. It just requires us to do essentially more assessment and to incorporate that into our housing element. Similarly, so there are areas that are called racial ethnic areas of concentration of poverty, which is RECAPs, where there are enough people in poverty that are concentrated in a particular area to meet a certain threshold, and then they are categorized as RECAPs. And there are racially concentrated areas of affluence, which are called RCAAs, where similarly wealth is concentrated and there is a segregation and exclusion of other communities. And, HCD asked us for more analysis of conditions and factors within RECAPs and RCAAs and to compare those to the region. There's a little bit of confusion because we technically in the unincorporated county, we don't have any formal RECAPs. But we can make comparisons to areas that are similar to RECAPs, but maybe not quite at the legal threshold. And we can certainly do more analysis of the RCAAs. We're going to clarify with HCD exactly what they're looking for in this assessment, but I think it probably is that. Even if we don't have formal RECAPs, they want us to look at, where is poverty concentrated? How does that compare to the region? How does that compare to other jurisdictions? And similarly with areas of affluence, how is that situated in the broader region so that there's context? Assessment of disproportionate housing needs, including displacement. So HCD would like us to describe concentrations of substandard housing, both locally and regionally. So housing that is in poor quality, does not meet the standards for habitation that it should, may need rehabilitation or replacement, issues with housing stock such as that. This one is very hard to find data for, to be quite frank. We are conferring with our partners and our consultants to determine if there are ways to go about this, both locally and regionally, because neither we nor anyone we work with has been able to obtain good data. So I could discuss this in a little more detail later, but it may be that we have to commit to programs to find that data and add it as we move forward with the housing element. HCD asked us to clarify if our point in time homeless count, it says county here, it's count, the 1 day homeless count where where staff fans out across the county and across the cities and counts homelessness over the course of a single day. HCD asked us to clarify that is representative of the county. That is the homeless count that we have, and we rely on it extensively. We believe it's representative. We don't know what they mean by representative exactly. So this is just an area of clarification. It may be they want us to compare to other data sources or other jurisdictions to see if it's comparable, or whether we think the 1 day count was an anomaly on that particular day. So this one is just, we have to clarify with HCD. We're not entirely sure what the direction of that comment is, but we will do so. And then they asked us to analyze areas that are sensitive to displacement, housing displacement due to disaster, due to environmental factors, earthquakes, flooding, fire, and others. The housing element did not include that, so we just need to include that assessment with our resubmittal. The sites inventory and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So we did analyze all of the sites in the sites inventory and the rezoning program, where they would be located and whether those provided access to opportunity, whether those were concentrating poverty in particular areas in ways that would increase segregation and decrease integration, or vice versa. But HCD wants more extensive neighborhood by neighborhood analysis of those sites. Essentially more data, more granular analysis. So we did provide some of this, but the gist of this comment is they want far more. And there is quite a bit of data out there provided by the state that we can rely on. So this is an assessment we can do and that will be included. So this goes back to rehabilitation need again. Housing stock condition. HCD would like us to identify the number of units in the unincorporated county that are in need of rehabilitation or replacement. In prior housing element cycles, we just used the age of housing stock. We said, well, these were built before 1940. These were built before 1930. We think they need rehabilitation. These were built post 1960, post 1970, et cetera. We know the types of housing that were built on average in those eras. We know the typical lifespan of those housing units. We think this is the number that needs rehab or replacement. That's not an acceptable method at this point. What HCD wants is much more direct quantitative data on the condition of housing. We don't have it at present. Again, we are looking for it, but it may be that we propose addressing this by saying, during the housing element cycle, we will undertake a research program that looks in depth at the condition of housing and then provides policies to address the rehabilitation needs. So it may be a commitment to do this without actually having the assessment at the time of housing element adoption. Whether that's acceptable to HCD remains an open question, but it may be that that's all we really have to offer. The housing programs, the comment letter identifies many programs for which HCD would like greater specificity, would like firmer deadlines and timelines, specific amounts of funding that we intend to seek and to distribute, specific action items, and other levels of detail. So, and this is not a surprise. Every jurisdiction has received a comment that is very similar to this. HCD really wants to see us building out these programs with specific milestones for completion and really, really hard targets for what we're trying to do with the program. So we and the housing department, and most of these programs are under the auspices of the housing department. We and the housing department are working on that together. We will do so as best we can. In some cases, HCD is asking us for commitments to how much grant funding from certain grant sources we will be seeking, and it really is dependent on the grants available and the projects for which they would be eligible, for them. So it's a very hard thing to commit to, but we can say minimums. We will commit to seeking at least this much grant funding, and hopefully that would be a satisfactory commitment. Because yeah, it is trying to nail down some details on things that tend to be somewhat ambiguous and unpredictable, but we will do the best we can. HCD asked us for better housing cost data. So we provided housing cost data, and most jurisdictions in the county did the same, relying on 2020 census data on how much housing, what are housing prices, how much are rents, how affordable are those, how overburdened by housing costs are people at various income levels. And HCD has asked for more local data such as Zillow, apartments.com, and other sources that show what housing is being offered for in the present moment. So all we need to do is supplement the data that we already provided with that kind of more granular data. Progress in meeting the RHNA. This was a comment that was a little bit confusing. The county's RHNA, quote unquote, may be reduced by the number of new units built since June 30, 2022. However, the element must demonstrate their affordability through a number of mechanisms. We did not do this. We didn't reduce the RHNA using units built since June 30, 2022. So I think either this is just a general admonition that went into every letter that every jurisdiction received, or we need to clarify that we didn't follow this method because it may have been ambiguous in the housing element. The realistic development capacity, which I mentioned earlier, HCD is asking for much more extensive assessment of the factors that make us think that sites are developable and redevelopable. Local trends, market factors, neighborhood conditions on the sites themselves. We did include quite a bit of that, but there's always more data that can be provided. So we will build out that analysis, but we also will pursue a little more clarity from HCD on exactly what that looks like. And we are also looking at other jurisdictions that have a certified housing element, who have completed it, and HCD has signed off on it, and see how they provided that data as well. Following up on realistic development capacity. So this is a little bit of confusion. HCD essentially misunderstood the nature of our commercial and neighborhood mixed use designations, the ones that are in North Fair Oaks and the ones that we have commercial zones called commercial mixed use and neighborhood mixed use in North Fair Oaks, as you know, and we had proposed for the rezoning program also to apply those or very similar zoning to the rezoning sites. Those commercial and neighborhood mixed use zones require a non-residential ground floor with multifamily residential above. That is the base use. But because they're called commercial, it appears that HCD assume they allow 100% commercial uses on the site, which is not true. So there are a number of comments saying, justify why you think that 100% commercial sites will be built with residential. They're not 100% commercial sites. So we will clarify that. I think part of the issue may have been that the analysis that demonstrates that and describes it appeared primarily in an appendix, which may have been glossed over in HCD's review. So it's a fairly straightforward fix, and we will make it clear that that is the case. Again, suitability of non-vacant sites. This goes to redevelopability again. We provided information on current uses. We provided specific improvement to land ratios, which means what's the value of the building on a property versus the value of the property itself. The lower the value of the building versus the property, the lower that ratio is, the more redevelopable a site typically is. We also provided recent trends, but I think that HCD just wants significantly more supplementary data in more detail, and we will provide that. Small sites. So sites smaller than half an acre are deemed inadequate to accommodate housing for lower income groups, unless it is demonstrated that sites of equivalent size or affordability were developed in the prior planning period. We have had a number of sites. So we took the 0.5 acres and we said, we think sites that are 0.4 acres or above are developable because we had a number of them in the prior period, and because we have a number of them in progress right now in the pipeline. But that did not satisfy HCD apparently. So we really need to clarify with them, because we thought we had provided the kind of trend data and the actual on the ground project data to say, yes, these are feasible because they're actually happening. They have been happening, and they are lower income sites. So they're affordable projects on those sites. But we clearly HCD would like to see more, and we do need to clarify exactly what the nature of that more is. SB9 sites. So as I said, our sites inventory included projections of SB9. So again, this is a state law that says single family zone parcels can be either split in two with 2 new units built on either parcel, or 4 units can be built essentially on the one parcel. We took all of the SB9 applications we had received since the start of SB9 when the law passed, and then we cut that in half. And we said, we think that's what's going to happen every year, very conservatively. So if there are 12 applications, we said, well, we think we'll get 6 every year. Maybe it'll increase a little bit over time, and we'll end up with this many units out of those applications. And HCD's response was, that aggregated trend analysis is insufficient. You need to look at each potential SB9 site and tell us why you think that one will flip. And yes, that's effectively impossible. So, and there were 2 other jurisdictions in the county that also did the same thing. They relied on the trends that had happened so far, and they projected it forward. HCD flatly rejected that as well. So we may just have to give up on projecting SB9. It's interesting because this is a law the state passed. It's working. You would think that we would assume that it's going to continue working, but they want to see much more detail than we simply have available. So we will clarify that. We're going to discuss that with HCD, but we kind of think this is a foregone conclusion. We'll have to just take this out of the assessment. Again, a little confusion. Replacement housing requirements at sites identified in multiple housing element periods. If the site inventory identifies sites with existing residential units that meet specific conditions, we should have a replacement housing requirement. Essentially, if the sites are going to be redeveloped and they meet certain conditions, lower income housing and other conditions, we should have a program to replace them. We don't believe there are any such sites in our sites inventory. So we need to clarify with HCD, is this a general admonition that everyone receives, which is likely, or did you see some that you think are meeting those conditions in our sites inventory, and we can double check and make sure that's not the case. And similarly, sites identified in prior planning periods for low-income housing shall not be deemed adequate for low-income housing unless a program that meets certain requirements, including rezoning, is adopted. We did not identify any lower income sites from prior planning periods. All of the lower income sites are new, either sites that weren't included before or sites that are intended for rezoning. So I think this, again, is probably a general piece of advice, but we need to clarify that with HCD as well. Accessory dwelling unit projections. So HCD asserted to us that our ADU projections are inconsistent with HCD's records. We made an assumption that when in 2019, the new state law came in and changed the possibility of making ADUs on essentially every single family zone sites. And we immediately saw a very large increase. We adopted the state law. And in fact, we adopted more generous regulations than the state law. ADU production went up significantly and has stayed significantly up since 2019. We took those years, 2019 through 2022, and we said, we're going to see, we think we'll see ADU production consistent with those years because the law has changed. It's become much easier. And we think we'll see a gentle increase over the next 8 years. And HCD said, no, we want to see something that's more consistent with the entirety of the last housing element period. So we're going to have a discussion with HCD and see what assumptions we may be able to make. Again, this is a case where we felt like we should all take credit for what the state has done. It's working. We assume it will continue to work, but it doesn't seem like that is an acceptable methodology. So it's likely we will have to pare those numbers down somewhat. It's just a matter of how much we'll have to pare them down. Zoning for a variety of housing types. The housing element should demonstrate and describe compliance with standards for emergency shelters, permanent supportive housing, low barrier navigation centers, and SROs. We have either adopted standards or we comply with the state standards for every one of these types of development. But it is true that in some cases we haven't updated our zoning regulations consistent with the practice of following the state law. I think it will be sufficient for us to have a program in the housing element that says, yes, we are following these standards. We follow the state's regulations scrupulously. We will change all of the zoning that may have outdated language, amend it to be exactly compliant with state law. ADU regulations, HCD has asserted that they believe the county's ADU regulations may be out of compliance with state law, but they haven't had time to completely review. We did send them to HCD in 2020, but they have not yet completed a full review. They intend to provide a more substantive assessment of how they think they are out of compliance. There are some minor changes that we know of. We are updating our ADU regulations right now. So we will add a program in the housing element that describes that ongoing update and that describes what we think the differences are. They are fairly small and fairly easy to capture. So we are already in process of doing that. We just did not describe it in the housing element update, and we'll do so. But also hopefully we do get the assessment from HCD that describes what they think the differences from state law are, because it would be very helpful for us to know the areas that they think are out of compliance. So HCD asserted that the housing element should describe the constraints on development presented by all of our land use controls, our fees and exactions. So land use controls, zoning, maximum density, maximum floor area of a building on a parcel, parking, and other land use controls, all of our fees and exactions, permitting fees, building fees, impact fees, our local processing and permit procedures for different type of development, the planned unit development process, which I'll touch on in a moment, and design review regulations. We provided what we felt was extensive information and analysis of all of these areas except the PUD process. But we will discuss with HCD what more extensive data and analysis might be required, and we will also be looking at what other jurisdictions have done. We worked throughout the entire housing process. We worked with consultants, the 21 Elements Collaborative, and a number of sub-consultants who worked for most of the jurisdictions in the county. And this analysis was almost identical across jurisdictions. So the jurisdictions, the very few jurisdictions that have achieved certification by now, will have addressed this comment if they received it from HCD, and we'll be able to see how they addressed it. For the plan unit development process, that is when a developer comes in and they have a parcel and they want to essentially adopt a set of zoning regulations that are specifically for that parcel that is tied to a specific development process. They're not required to do so. It's optional. It's at a developer's incentive. It's no constraint to development whatsoever. So I think this is just a case of HCD may have thought we require this process of developers, but that is not the case. HCD asked us to assess whether the county's density program complies with the state density bonus law, which has been updated recently quite a few times. We have not captured all of the changes. We are doing so, and we will assert that in the housing element. The changes, again, are very minor. We did a comprehensive update in the last several years, but the law changes every year. So we essentially, it's just a continuous process of us updating our codes to capture what the state has changed. We'll add that as a program in the housing element. Constraints and transparency. So HCD asked us to describe and analyze local amendments to the building code and the degree and type of enforcement for impacts on housing supply and affordability. We did not adopt any local amendments that have any impact, but we will describe that. We didn't do so. And I think just a statement of that fact is all that HCD wants to see. And also clarify compliance with, there are a number of new transparency requirements for our zoning regulations having to be posted online, our development standards having to be posted online, our inclusionary housing ordinance having to be posted online, fees having to be posted online. They all are posted on our website. We think we meet these requirements, and we describe that in the housing element. HCD said they must be described for each parcel. And there's some curiosity whether they mean when you click on a parcel in our GIS system, does it go to all that information? Is that what they mean? Or do they just mean we didn't describe it enough when we need to provide more information on it? So we will clarify that. We thought we had met this requirement, quite frankly, in some detail, but we will clarify with HCD what exactly they are looking for here. Our inclusionary housing ordinance. So the county has, as I think most of the council is probably aware, an ordinance that says if you build multifamily housing of greater than 5 units, 20% of those units must be affordable to lower income groups. HCD tends to assume that inclusionary housing ordinances are a potential constraint to housing development, and they want us to provide more analysis of how that is or is not a constraint, and to describe the various mechanisms of the inclusionary ordinance, including how much affordability is mandated and what options are there to provide it in different ways. Can you pay an in lieu fee? Can you build the affordable housing offsite? Can you make a land dedication instead of providing the housing? All of which our ordinance allows, and to be honest, all of which is already described in the housing element. And we also provided a significant amount of assessment going to why we feel it's not a constraint. So this is one we really have to have a discussion with HCD and just get to, was that just missed? Was it just not enough? Are there other sources that we can turn to kind of describe this in more detail? Because this one was a little confusing because we thought we had gone the extra mile to actually meet this requirement. Our rezoning program. So the housing element does describe a shortfall of sites to meet our RHNA and indicates that rezoning will occur to accommodate the RHNA. And we included multiple programs that describe those rezonings. HCD asked us to specifically commit to acreage, allowable density, and anticipated units. As you can see from the table that we showed, the anticipated units are described in some detail. We did specifically commit to rezoning, and we did describe the exact acreage we intended to rezone, the densities that would be allowed by the zoning that we intend to rezone to, and the timeline for that rezoning. However, it's all in an appendix. our question is, was that appendix not enough? Was there more information that was required, or was the appendix just perhaps not delved into by the reviewers, and we can just bring that forward into the body of the housing element, and that will satisfy this requirement. And again, HCD did take issue with some of our assumptions about size of sites and not having enough detail about why the sites are developable or redevelopable. We probably will not be able to entirely satisfy them. We probably will have to adjust various sites. There's also an issue with the Harbor Industrial Area where the city of Belmont is interested in annexing that and rezoning it differently. And we are in negotiation with them. We may have to remove some of the sites from the Harbor Industrial, shift sites around, make different assumptions. So I would say the upshot of that is our sites inventory will necessarily change in multiple ways. We may have to identify other areas for rezoning, but again, we don't intend to do so. We've done plenty of rezoning in North Fair Oaks, and new state laws also make North Fair Oaks redevelopable in multiple ways without any of the rezonings we have done. So there is no intention to further upzone in North Fair Oaks. So the next steps. So again, we are assessing with the housing department and with our fair housing consultants and with Baird and Driscoll 21 Elements, who are the consultants that worked with all of the jurisdictions on these comments. And we are drafting a set of responses on how we will, and strategies on how we will meet what HCD has commented to us. We are also comparing what other jurisdictions have received in their comments and how they've met them. And the next step after that is to schedule a meeting. And this is the common next step, is you meet directly with HCD, you work through the comment letter, you ask for clarification on things that are unclear, you provide additional information if it's already available, discuss the proposed strategies, see what they think about how well those would comply with state law. And then we draft the amendments. So we get HCD's sense of how well our proposed amendments will work before we go through the drafting process. Then we draft them. The housing element has to be recirculated for public review. And then we move into the resubmittal and adoption hearings. We would resubmit the draft to HCD for their re-review. And then we would again move forward to the Planning Commission and to the board. It says here Planning Commission hearing is tentatively scheduled for June 21st. That is now July 12th or 13th, whatever the Wednesday is. So that's been bumped slightly. And with that, yes, I believe that is all of the, and I'm sorry, there's no way to make this exciting. It's a dry and technical inventory, but I hope it was not too painful. And I would open it up to any comments and any discussion that the council will have, and any questions or anything that I can clarify.
Are there questions from council members?
I do have a couple.
Go ahead.
No, you start.
Thank you, Will, for great work. I know that's a lot, so thank you. I'm still confused going back to the very beginning where it looks like the response is that we will get the housing that we need in these other areas. So Palma, Harbor District. So what concerns me is that I thought I saw a lot more when reading through my stuff about things that needed to happen in North Fair Oaks. And my concern on a level that I'm totally new to zoning and whatnot is that it all goes over there, and then North Fair Oaks becomes a free-for-all for development. And I'm sorry, but that still is something that really is of concern to me, that we can push it off to other areas, and then whatever the terms are, planned unit development, or developers can come in and kind of do whatever they want because we've already met what we need to do over here. It feels like a free-for-all in North Fair Oaks, and that just doesn't seem fair to me. So.
Okay, understood. I may have been a little unclear. So they're kind of multiple issues. So we're not proposing rezoning, changing the zoning regulations to allow it, for the RENA, for our sites inventory that says how much we need to provide and what sites will provide. We did identify sites that we think are potentially redevelopable or developable in North Fair Oaks, but we're not changing the zoning of those sites to allow more development or different development. when we looked at all the sites that are already zoned for various types of residential uses, that we found, including North Fair Oaks and everyone, that we looked at the entire county, the coast side, every unincorporated territory, and we said, here are all the sites that we think are buildable in the next 8 years. And here's what we think they're buildable with. How many units could go on there? What type of housing? And when we did that, we didn't have enough to meet what the state wants us to do. So then we said, well, where will we change the regulations to allow more units? And those areas are Colma, Broadmoor, and unincorporated Belmont. So we're not targeting North Fair Oaks for a change in the regulations. The zoning regulations in North Fair Oaks still control what can be done with development and the maximum amount of development. Those regulations still apply. On the flip side, however, because North Fair Oaks is a community that is in proximity to El Camino Real, which has transit, and transit is called high quality transit by the state, there is some degree to which we cannot actually limit the amount of development, and in particular, how much parking is required. The state has tied our hands, but that's not just North Fair Oaks. It's also Belmont. It's also Colma. It's also Daly City. It's everywhere that's near really rich, is a transit, what they call a transit rich area. So we're not relaxing the rules in North Fair Oaks. There's nothing that says because we've met these these needs through rezoning, then you can do anything. All of the regulations still apply in North Fair Oaks, but there is, to a certain extent, new state laws that are changing the way we are allowed to regulate development in any area that's near transit. So it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that part I do understand, and I appreciate that. I guess I was keep going. That I do understand. Go ahead, Evan, sorry.
Ever go ahead, please.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. If you can go starting from your slide number 45, if you could explain what county density bonus is.
Oh, sure. Let's see. So the density bonus, so there is a state law. State density bonus law. So there is a state law that says that any multifamily housing project that provides a certain minimum number of units that are affordable to lower income populations, or that provides senior housing, or that provides housing for supportive housing, or housing for the formerly homeless, transitional housing. If the development provides a certain percentage of units in that project, then they get a number of benefits. One of them is they get more density. So if 20 units are allowed on the site by our zoning regulations, and they provide 20% of the housing as affordable, they could have 30 units, sometimes 40 units instead of 20. Basically, it just says your zoning is no longer the cap on the density. And they also get some other exemptions as well. So if there's a limit of, say, 50, you can only build on 50% of the parcel, and you provide this affordable housing, the state says, well, no, that 50% no longer applies. You can build a larger area of the parcel. You don't have to provide as much parking. You can go over height. Essentially what the state density bonus law does, and we're required to implement it through our own density bonus ordinance. So that's what we've been doing. We've been updating our density bonus ordinance to comply with state law, because essentially our ordinance is an implementing ordinance for the state's law. So what the state density bonus law says is, in exchange for providing these affordable or special needs housing as a portion of a project, you get relaxation of a number of rules that would normally apply because of zoning.
Yeah, thank you. Then 2 slides before that, wonder if you can elaborate on that a bit more, and what the county regulations are. Are they too lax or too stringent, or why are they not accepting that?
So essentially every year since 2019, the state has made the regulations more relaxed. And every time we've come back and made our regulations more relaxed in order to comply with state law. The last 2 years, we didn't do the updates because it's very, quite frankly, burdensome to do a large regulatory update every year, every time the state passes the new law. We were just waiting to capture them all after a number of years. We are generous, and we started out more generous than the state law to a certain extent. We allowed more height. We allowed larger ADUs than we were required to. The state has kind of caught up in various ways and passed us, and now we need to change our regulations. So for instance, last year's legislative session at the state level adopted a regulation that says if you can't fit so we have to allow at least an 800 square foot ADU on a parcel. That's the minimum. But it used to be, we don't have to allow in the front yard. It can be in the backyard. Now the state says if it doesn't fit in the backyard, you have to allow it in the front yard. Our ordinance doesn't say that. So that's an example of one change we haven't captured yet. So it's not more stringent. It's definitely more relaxed.
Okay, thank you. And then on slide number 28, it deals with no recaps in North Fair Oaks. I wonder what constitutes that, because I understood that there were people in North Fair Oaks who were under the poverty level.
Yes.
So I'm not sure that I'm understanding that.
So the closest thing the county has to recap, and it's I think it may technically be called a potential recap or an edge recap, where it's on the border of becoming what the formal definition is a portion of North Fair Oaks. And it's a combination of poverty, a concentration of poverty by race. So in this case, primarily Latino population that meets certain poverty criteria. And so North Fair Oaks is close. And as we do this analysis, we did do this analysis for North Fair Oaks, but I think what the state wants is more substantive analysis for North Fair Oaks and also other areas which may not be quite as close as to meeting that threshold, but which we could look at in the same way. But you're absolutely correct. The closest thing we have is North Fair Oaks.
Okay, thank you. And the final question, slide number 31, I think it deals with housing stock improvement or something to that effect, right? Yeah. I think because you mentioned that there was no data, and I'd like to suggest that some of the community-based organizations, they have done work, and this might be throughout county, for all I know, but at least I'm thinking about El Concilio of San Mateo County, who has done, for several years, they have done housing improvement programs like weatherization and, other things that may actually be some, if not substantial, some helpful data that may tell about the housing stock quality.
Yeah,
So just wanted to throw that in as a suggestion.
I think that's an excellent, I believe the housing department actually made a very similar suggestion. So I think that's exactly on point. They talked about, there are some community-based organizations and maybe other organizations that have done, maybe not the whole county, but certain areas. And if we can reach out to them, then maybe we can find some of this and piece it together. And at least it's better than what we have now.
Yeah. One last question, and this is true, the last one. If was it Belmont you mentioned that could be acquiring that adjacent unincorporated piece of land? If they end up doing so, what would happen then? Would you have to scramble and find additional units elsewhere?
So the annexation itself would probably not take place for quite some time, but what we don't want to be in a situation where we have zoned this area for something that Belmont is really not intending to have happen and to have them just rezone it. We want to make sure that if we want to make sure that if Belmont intends to take that land and use it for something else, we take that into account and we find enough sites to accommodate that before that ever happens. So if we had already rezoned it and it was already designated for housing, and that had been in place, say it had been in place from previous cycles and Belmont annexed it, then I really, from our perspective, nothing would happen. We had done our job. It's housing, it's zoned appropriately. But we're partner jurisdictions. We want to actually make sure the housing is going to happen. If we zone it for housing, they acquire it and they rezone it for something else and the housing never happens, we're not meeting the commitment that we have both to work together as jurisdictions, but also to meet what the state wants us to really do. If we have knowledge that this may not be a realistic possibility, then we should definitely find other sites in advance.
Thank you.
Questions, Juan Carlos? Blair, do you have anything? I have a couple of questions. Well, on going back to Belmont and Harbor Industrial, could Belmont be working to annex that area to meet their housing numbers? I mean, is that it, or do they have some other ideas in mind
I
there?
think they want to, I think the intent may be to use it as a mix, maybe some housing, but also life sciences and a mix of commercial and industrial. I do not think their intent is to significantly develop it as housing. And I don't think it has anything to do with meeting their housing element requirements. So that's really where the conflict, if they were completely intent on rezoning it for multifamily housing and we were completely intent on that, we would all be in accord and it would not be an issue. It's the question of if the intent of the actual future use is different from the jurisdiction that actually will be requiring it, then we have to accommodate, we have to take that into account.
I haven't been, this is the first I've become aware of it. Has there been pushback in the Belmont community around the potential for that to be developed as relatively high density housing, or I haven't seen anything in the press on it?
No pushback. This is just more an intergovernmental conversation
Okay.
about what is appropriate for these sites.
The other point I had was going back to the issue of the small parcels, the 0.4, 0.5, 0.6 acres. I just went through the sites inventory and found 7 of them that were kind of in that anywhere from 0.46 to 0.59 acres. 3 in particular, the 2 on Edison and the 1 on Hurlingame, that are about a half acre and theoretically could have up to 50 units on them. What do those developments look like? You said we have projects like that in the pipeline. Take 412 Hurlingame, where it's half an acre and we're talking at least 50 housing units on there. Is that, I mean, obviously it's multi-story. How many stories is that?
We've been seeing something
You just,
on the,
you froze up a bit, Will. Did we, okay. Sure how to.
the range of, I think, Diana, do you have me now or no?
We have you now, Will.
Okay, thank you.
There we go.
Good.
We lost about 45 seconds or so.
Okay. So it varies, but we've been seeing proposals 6, 7 stories. And it kind of depends on what the developer wants to do with the site, but because they do get the density bonus, they can tend to go pretty high and pretty dense even on the smaller sites. HCD does not have a problem with 0.5 acre sites or larger. It's really when you're below 0.5 acres that they start to take issue with it. But the reason that they can put so much density on those sites is the state density bonus that allows them to have greater height than they otherwise would be afforded. So the constraint becomes just what can you actually fit on the site at that point, much less than what our regulations say.
What's the zoning of those sites right now?
I think that's commercial mixed use. I'm not sure which zone exactly. I can follow up with that, but I believe that is mapped. So if you look at the housing element sites inventory, it does show the existing zoning in there as well.
Okay, I didn't see that on there. My real concern in a lot of these is those are densely populated neighborhoods to begin with. When I see very low and low income there and that number of units, it's like the parking requirements are probably nothing. And that's more cars out on the street, traffic issues. I don't know what we do about that, but those projects in particular really give me cause for concern.
Yeah, that concern is, I think, understandable, reasonable. We've discussed it before. I think, again, I think we make a disclaimer in the housing element. We have to do this assessment. It's not an expression of where the county necessarily always wants the housing to go. It is an expression of our analysis of where it can go. But the changes in state law have made it far more complicated because, as you say, the parking requirements are now significantly lower than we ever thought they would be. And that's a real challenge that I think we're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, I was excited to see the potential for that many units in the harbor area, perhaps,
Yeah.
taking some of the pressure off of some of these smaller parcels in an FO. And now it sounds like, well, harbor might not happen and we may need a significant number of those to achieve our goals.
We will definitely be seeking other sites outside of North Fair Oaks as the need. There are other areas. We don't think they're quite as ripe as we thought the Belmont area and some of the other areas are, but we'll be doing our best to find other sites to take the pressure off.
Okay. That's all I had. George, please.
I apologize, I came late, so I missed a large part of this, so please fill me in if I'm missing something here. The proposed sites that, in the red dotted lines, is that proposed sites that the county is considering buying or that are available undeveloped at the moment?
The red lines are projects that are already in our pipeline. People have proposed the projects, they're significantly advanced. And we think those are basically advanced enough in the process. They've expended enough money, time, and resources that they are going to happen.
Okay, so to reach our density that the state's requiring, that pretty much means that we are relying on private citizen developers to sell the properties that are there and say, hey, we want to buy up an entire city block or half a city block essentially to even consider building anything. What timeline that takes a lot of time. Are we going to even be able to meet state requirements, assuming developers are going to want to come in and do that?
It depends. So in some cases, I do think the development would happen through site consolidation. But in other cases, it will be, as Brooks is saying, there are small sites that people have been developing. We've seen some, Palo Alto Housing Corporation or Alta Housing on El Camino, now Alta Housing on El Camino, consolidated 2 sites and built there. The Middlefield Junction site, which you see in the red line, is one big parcel that the county dedicated to an affordable housing developer, and they will build there. It's really a variety. We do think some site consolidation will happen. I think that's absolutely true. But we also are just identifying what can be built on the parcels as they exist now, based on the current zoning, based on kind of what realistic constraints are there, not based on density bonuses. We're not taking that into account. We're saying our regulations allow X amount of housing. To be honest, once we have identified the sites and we think they're feasible and realistic, it is on the private market. There is no requirement that we provide a lot of money and we do dedicate land as a county, and we provide other assistance, technical assistance. We work nonprofits, we work with developers, but typically, the onus is on the private market and how we can incentivize the private market and insist the private market to build this housing.
Just to go back to what the rest of this group was saying, parking is a major challenge, and with the current density requirements that we have, If I look at what I have at Middlefield and Third, it's a decent sized lot, but it's not large enough to build anything and make it worthwhile to incentivize anyone to really want to develop that. We've got a lot of small lots similar to that. So unless we're coming in at half an acre above, and people are just buying up large swaths of properties to merge them, we're gonna have to change density requirements to really incentivize anyone.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this is what HCD says as well. They think the realistic sites are 0.5 acres and above. We went slightly below that just because we had seen a trend of some of those being built. It may be we take those out of the inventory, thinking that they're unrealistic, and we exchange them for other sites in other areas of the county that are larger. But that doesn't solve the parking.
No, we need a
You know,
garage or something.
Yeah, I just think this,
Structure.
yeah. The
That was
parking
actually
issue
kind of
is,
where I was going, Will, if it was possible to pull us out of there simply because it just looks like they're going to that would exacerbate problems that we already have. And, you know, quite honestly, North Fair Oaks is taking, I believe, 1,700 units in the housing element against a goal of 2,800. So we're doing our share on this thing, but to build projects that we know are going to exacerbate a problem like that is, I think it's worth looking at. It's certainly worth considering removing
Yeah.
it. Sorry.
we may very well not only choose to, but have to take out the smaller sites, but just keep in mind, this is an analytical exercise. It doesn't make them non-buildable that they're not identified in the housing element. Although it may be that the housing element, by identifying them, spurs people to look at them. And so that there is a bit of a kind of incentive there. But they are zoned, you know, they continue to be developable, even if we don't include them. But I do think there are some assumptions that we have to re-examine regarding the smaller sites. And then there is the elephant in the room, which is the state has basically taken parking out of our hands, and what do we do with it?
Can we
Because
not push back? No, seriously, I mean, you've got Huntington Beach, you've got other counties that are pushing back and winning. Marin County is not even required to have any of these elements, which why can't we push back to some degree?
There are jurisdictions that are pushing back against the housing element requirements. They have not, to my knowledge, been succeeding, but we do lobby the state, and I think along with other counties and other jurisdictions, and I do think there's going to be significant pushback against the way this is done in the next cycle, because this is not what I'm here to present today necessarily, but I would just say there is a significant amount of frustration in every jurisdiction across the state with how this happened this year and the way the state is definitely trying to solve the housing crisis by putting it on the backs of the local jurisdictions. We all are aware of the problems that it causes. We have to wrestle with it. This is our job. And we can try to find solutions that are outside of requiring parking that we would otherwise require. I would also say, I don't think any developer really wants to come in and provide no parking, because their tenants do not want that. But again, it may not be in the amounts we would like to see. And I think we are going to have to think about some out of the box strategies, which we've talked about at this council before. But it's a real challenge.
Kathleen, please go ahead.
In the spirit of community council, I think it's only fair that we take some of those headaches away from you guys at your level, Will, and the housing department, and possibly if there's a way to get in front of some of the developers that purchase this property, and we as a council on a grassroots effort go to them and say, look, we know this is what's going on here, but we know this community better than you do. We want to see you be successful and build or not build. But I feel like, and when I say developers they can do whatever they want, they can do whatever they want, and they've done it in the Bay Area. And I think in the spirit of community, it might be our job, not your job, but our job to try to work with developers and work with people that buy up some of these sites and say, hey, come on, do you really want to be hated here? I mean, do you want to do something for the community, or do you want to just put something up, or just like sort of like a TJ Homes is hated? They're absolutely hated by a lot of neighbors. And, you know, I always feel sorry for the people that move into them because they're nice people, but, you know, they get the brunt of that. So at a community level, I feel like it should, you know, it shouldn't be on you guys. I think it should be on us. I also want to get in my car and drive up to Sacramento and have a conversation up there with, hey, do you realize that in some of the neighborhoods that you put these requirements on, it's not a good quality of life issue. I mean, it's a quality of life issue for a whole bunch of people. And then you have people that say just build, and you know, what is it? Trickle down housing, that will work. I don't believe that works for a second. But, you know, you've got that, you've got environmentalists that believe that everybody can ride a bike to work. So, I mean, we're up against things that these guys aren't responsible for, but I think at a community level, going door to door and starting to talk to people and building a voice for, hey, this doesn't work. And
I agree. To add to
I think
that,
that's our
it kind
job.
of eliminates, I'm thinking holistically here. If the state's stepping in and saying, you're gonna have to do this and forget the zoning laws and regulations, what purpose do we serve? We
Right.
can't say no.
Right, and
Honestly,
I
what
don't
we're
think
doing-
it's on Will and his group.
No.
I'd like to work with the housing. The only other thing that I'd like to know is how to get a hold of the people that, or how to see the filings that are done with planning to see what's happening before we're asked to approve a grading permit. You know, like how do we find out earlier kind of what's going on? I'm like, I found just the other day, got on Zillow and found 4 properties in North Fair Oaks. I thought, oh, okay, we could get, you know, a couple duplexes or triplexes. Who could we get to buy this property and get some housing done? Yeah, anyway, I'm going off, but it's more of a grassroots thing, I think, that will help.
Could you remind us, Will, because the requirement for a grading permit and approval of the grading permit has changed with a lot more of those projects. And I constantly forget the terminology that's used, but they just go through as a matter of law or
Yes, for the
They don't require
multifamily,
that.
yeah, for single family, there hasn't really been a change. For multifamily projects, we are required to review them objectively without discretion, ministerially is
that's the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
So really, we can't, if the grading permit meets the requirements of the grading ordinance, it's approved automatically. There's no longer an opportunity to qualitatively assess it and subjectively assess it. And that's just a factor of state law. That's the change.
You bring up a really good point though, Kathleen, because we had a area not too far from where I live, to be honest with you, where TJ Homes came in and built 3 houses. The neighbors got really, really upset.
Mhm.
So we had a council meeting. We brought TJ Homes in and the neighbors, and we opened a dialogue. And the neighbors didn't get what they wanted, which was basically no development in their area. But TJ Homes was compromising on different things and stuff. And I think we could probably take that model and use it when, you know, developers come in and be the voice of the community and, you know, they're going to build what they're going to build, but we can have an influence on what that looks like. And who knows what good could come of having dialogues like that. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind, in particular, as these larger projects come up with.
I think we had a meeting and the library, we want a new space for the library. Okay, Mr. Developer, all right, ground floor, new
There you go.
library for North Fair Oaks.
That's gonna raise the cost of rents. Money's gonna have to be passed on to some,
I'm just
but no, I,
thinking out loud, but it's like, yeah, all right, let's make some trade-offs here. And do it at a level like this and not because the laws have been passed and bills have been passed, but try to negotiate somehow.
One more question for you, Will. We're still out of compliance with the housing element law, obviously. Do you feel there's a risk of builder's remedy in North Fair Oaks? And do you know of any projects that are being contemplated in that regard?
I do not think so. To be honest, I think that, in case anyone doesn't know what the builder's remedy is, and we've talked about it a little bit, if you don't have a compliant housing element, there is the possibility for a developer to come in and propose a project that does not comply with your zoning or land use regulations. So you might have single family sites and they would proposed multifamily sites. But there are very few areas of the county where that is feasible, that we have not already zoned or state law has not already allowed that kind of development to happen anyway. So the fact that the housing element is not in compliance doesn't really put us at much risk of that, I don't believe. You know, there are other communities that have quite large sites that are very developable. Santa Monica obviously faced a lot of builders remedy cases. If people have been following it, that kind of is ground zero for the builders remedy, because the city has been rejecting multifamily housing for years and years. The county has been fairly housing friendly. We have a lot of areas that are zoned for fairly high density housing. And there are a lot of other areas that, because they're near transit, are going to allow that anyway, regardless of the housing element status. So I don't think our compliance luckily puts us at any greater risk. And at present, we've heard nothing. And, you know, we just do not have a reputation as being a county, a jurisdiction that really makes it difficult for developers, whereas some jurisdictions really do. So I don't think there's any backlog or anyone champing at the bit to develop something that they haven't already had the opportunity to do.
Are there any other questions from council members?
Yeah, I guess, so one of my concerns is also that, while it is true that state, mandates often don't understand, you know, the local community issues like, you know, our parking problems. There may be things that county could actually revise and perhaps exempt certain communities that are hurting with these issues. And I'm talking about the county density bonus. It sounds like this is actually a good thing for the you know, for increasing housing, but at the same time, it makes some exemptions that end up exacerbating the situation for the community in general. In terms of, you know, I guess the exemptions that they get in terms of increased height or parking exemptions and this kind of thing, I feel like there is something that a county could actually do, you know, by revising some of those policies, particularly for communities like North Fair Oaks. And I know that it may be difficult, but, you know, we are actually talking about neighbors getting into fights, getting into each other's nerves, because the parking issue is really, you know, ruling. I constantly read things that are awful on Nextdoor, that neighbors slashing tires of other neighbors just because they park, you know, in front of their houses. And yeah, it is really brutal. So I'm not sure if you can comment on that. Well,
My only comment, I think it's a well-made comment, and I absolutely understand and sympathize, but we are bound by law to follow exactly what the state density bonus law says. We actually cannot deviate from it. And if we did and we were sued, we would lose. I think that's the unfortunate circumstance that we're in. Is the state, you know, we cannot update our ordinance, or we could amend it to be different. But if that happened, the state law would supersede our ordinance. Any of the differences, the state law would trump. So I really think it's a question of, are there other solutions to parking in particular that are not allowed by state law, or, you know, that are maybe community wide, or something that gets to that without us deviating from the state density bonus law, because we really don't have that freedom, unfortunately.
No, it's something, what we probably need to do is agendize it in a regular meeting, or perhaps a study session, and discuss things like the potential of a permit system,
right.
Enforcement of commercial vehicles that are parked in neighborhoods and things like that. I don't think there's a big you know, we're gonna build an 8-story parking structure with shuttle services that people can use and stuff, but I think there are things that we can do, at least consider and propose to the board that might solve part of that problem. But,
Yeah, I agree.
you know, we discussed it in our planning session, something we wanted to look at this year. And I'll take the action to figure out when we can put that on the agenda. Who we need to involve in terms of developing and implementing solutions like that.
If I may,
Juan Carlos, please.
you bring up a really interesting issue, just to piggyback on the parking complex. Because North Fair Oaks is a mixed use and it's in a lot of its North Fair Oaks areas, mixed use between business and residential. You know, you have people, you know, running businesses out of their homes where they have multiple commercial vehicles, not even passenger vehicles, but commercial vehicles. And that upsets a lot of residents. And then you have residential homes right up against businesses. And a lot of that times that parking from that business does encroach in what people think, hey, this is my home. And now I have people coming and going all day and night. It's because I think maybe you bring up a good point about a permitting system, because this is not new. I mean, you know, other cities do this, you know, San Francisco, other cities, there is a permitting system. And maybe we've reached the point where we need to consider that to make it, you know, equitable to the resident and also equitable to the business owner, and set guidelines of hours and days and such, like all the systems, parking systems that are currently occurring. So
Let me take the action to figure out when we
Okay.
can get that on an agenda and who we need to talk to and have in the room to understand what's possible. Are there any other questions for Will from the council? Do we have any public comment, perhaps online?
During this time, members of the public, who wish to comment on agenda item number 3, please use the raise hand feature on Zoom or bring the speaker slip up to the clerk at this time. Last call for public comment.
I think there was a written comment submitted.
There was a
Was
written
it for
comment
reason?
submitted, which was published on the website.
Oh, okay, correct.
Okay, no public
Chair,
comment.
there is one hand raised on Zoom.
Terrific. Please.
Ophelia will grant you the access to speak and you will have 2 minutes when the timer starts. You may begin.
Thank you so much. Good evening, all. My name is Ophelia Bello. She, her. I am the Executive Director of Youth United for Community Action out of East Palo Alto. Collectively, as an organization, we have over 15 years of experience doing housing advocacy, a lot of tenant rights work, tenant protections work, pro-housing construction policies in East Palo Alto and the larger San Mateo County, as well as a pretty deep level of experience working on equitable land use policies. So I wanted to briefly introduce myself and also mention that unfortunately, because of a conflict, I missed the beginning part of the meeting, but I really wanted to, so I say that in case I might have missed this, but I really wanted to come on and just express appreciation to you all for the work that you're doing, as well as ask that if there hasn't been an extensive conversation, which I just may not be as informed about, I try to catch up as much as I possibly could before this. But if there hasn't been an extensive conversation or just deep, serious consideration for tenant protections, I please ask that the staff, council, everybody do so. I know there are some really amazing folks on the council, so perhaps this has already been discussed, and I just wanted to really emphasize my support for it. On my personal behalf, on behalf of our organization, this past weekend, we had the privilege of being in conversation with tenants from Redwood City, from Menlo Park, from East Palo Alto. And it just really shed light on how important tenant protections continue to be, whether that's as simple as, well, not simple, but a sort of starting point of considering a rental registry, all the way to just cause protections stronger at the local level than the state level, and even, when it's appropriate, rent stabilization. Thank you so much.
Comment about it. If there's no other public comment, thank you very much, Will, for your presentation this evening. I guess a lot of work to be done between now and July 12th, July 15th, something like that. I had a college flashback when I was reading through the feedback from HLC. You know, it's like you've worked on a term paper for 8 weeks and you get feedback from a professor and you've got to incorporate that feedback in 2 weeks. And I was just a little overwhelmed reading everything that you guys have to do to get it all done. But we all really appreciate the work and the effort you put into this. Thank you for your time presenting this evening. Thanks to the members of the public who attended and commented. Thanks to our county staff, Emma, Kenny, Deanna, Josh, Jennifer, Adam, and Tim for attending tonight. Our next council meeting is our regular session next week, May 25th, 7 to 9. We will be here, I presume. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Have a second?
Second.
All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks.
Thanks all. Thank you for having me.